Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening for a lovely story, because nothing beats a good story, and I enjoy listening to stories just like you do, so I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. And don't forget to go and get yourself that effervescent sparkling drink or something warm and comforting, because I've got a lovely story. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a Friday night in the early summer of 1982, and Lily Swanson had been waylaid, held up as usual. Why was she not surprised? This had happened to her yet again. She was second in command at the recruitment agency where she worked, diligently with her partner Peter Wallace at her side. They'd been running the recruitment agency for over 7 years, and in the last 4 years the business had boomed. The inevitable payoff after much arduous hard work that had cost them both blood, sweat and tears, and cemented between the two of them a firm friendship, born about from some tumultuous roller-coaster rides of emotional highs and lows. On this rather unfavourable, less than auspicious day, everything had gone terribly wrong for Lily in her dealings with difficult, very demanding clients. It would seem the weight of the business had fallen onto her very slim shoulders, and without Peter Wallace by her side to save the ceiling from collapsing in on her, things hadn't been easy. If anything else, the day had given her a brief insight into how invaluable Peter Wallace was for their business. She underestimated how hard the unassuming man actually worked. Let's just say he was responsible to a fault and worked tirelessly. He was always the first in the offices at the Exchange recruitment agency in Portland, and the very last to leave. Indeed, the providential Peter Wallace was one of those well-groomed men, always meticulously turned out in his pinstriped suits and debonair colourful ties, that always brought a splash of colour into the offices on some of those laboriously mundane days when the only view in the office was the beige walls and a piece of drab contemporary artwork done by a less than inspiring artist who had divorced colour from his canvases and had developed a love affair with grey and, of course, white. Peter Wallace would breeze into the offices like a cool wind blowing over the Atlantic, with an unflustered face. He was one of those insanely successful people who made things look so effortlessly easy when they were anything but. People like that Lily had hated at school, the ones who never studied for exams, but still successfully, rather facilely acquired an A++, while she had struggled to study until the early hours of the morning, and was terribly lucky if she acquired a B. Let's just say out in the big wide world, indispensable, efficacious people like Peter Wallace were few and far between, and he was a blessing to the business, and she counted her lucky stars that he had agreed to come into partnership with her. It was true he'd dealt with the real heavy brawn of their business, and the bull-headed, very difficult clients. In truth, she doubted their business would be so profitable without his progressively impressive magical touch. The man often made Lily sometimes feel out of her depth. He always knew how to headhunt the perfect employers for corporations, and had an instinctive knack for finding the right person to fit the right job, while Lily always struggled to select the right candidate for potential employers. So Peter Wallace was the one who was the lighthouse of their business, leading her away from tempestuous, choppy waters and helping her make sharp-witted decisions. But today, without his shrewd presence at the helm of her less than sturdy ship, things had gone badly awry. A couple of her exacting clients had told her they were withdrawing from her services and given her a mouthful about her gross incompetence. If Peter Wallace was here right now, he'd have had those clients eating directly out of his hands and probably inviting him out to lunch after soothing away their grievances like an arnica cream on an inflamed skin. This had not been a good day by any manner of means. Lily's father always used to say that if you were facing a really bad day, just head straight home to sleep for the rest of the afternoon and wake up the following day to embrace a brand new morning, which would likely be a whole lot better.
"We all have our lousy days," he would explain, "and when they come your way, the best solution is to just shut the world out, return to bed, watch a bit of television. The next day is bound to be so much better."
In truth, it was easier said than done. Lily couldn't abandon the agency with so much to do. Things had piled up during the day exponentially, especially without Peter around to ease the load. Why did he have to be away with his wife in Florida? On this occasion she had intended to leave the offices in the late afternoon, but it was now already early evening, and she had no idea how she was going to get through all this workload without Peter's invaluable help. Now, given the late time, she had to put the work aside. It would have to wait until after the weekend. She had some more pressing matters to attend to that demanded her immediate attention. Lily had accepted a dinner invitation from her boyfriend's parents that lived in a rural area, an hour's drive from Portland. Now she wished with all her heart she had declined the kind invitation. She was feeling fatigued. There was nothing she'd rather do than return to her own apartment and enjoy a glass of white Sauvignon Blanc while watching a movie and crashing out on the sofa. She was so weary and enervated from the day, like an alpine flower wilting in the valley that has been beholden to the uncongenial heat of the sun all day and feels completely faded. The last thing she wanted to do was to have dinner with Alice Montgomery, who'd become the thorn in her side in recent months. She knew Mrs. Montgomery had already made up her mind about her from the very first moment they'd met. In truth, she thought no one was good enough for her precious son. And although she had expressed her misgivings about Lily, she had done so in not so many words. So if Lily didn't turn up for dinner tonight, the already precarious, rather fragile relationship she had with Mrs. Montgomery, fraught with tension, was likely to end up on very shaky ground indeed. What was it that Mrs. Montgomery had said to her the last time they'd spent an evening together? She shuddered as she recalled the incident. The slender, willowy woman had risen from her chair, looking like an elegant ballerina in her graceful repose, wearing her black halter-neck dress with a string of pearls and an elegant pair of glitzy sandals on her perfectly manicured toes. She had walked over to Lily and bent down and whispered to Lily in her ear, "You're not good enough for my son, and I'll stop at nothing to ensure that he never, ever marries you. Do you understand?" Lily thought she must have imagined what Elliot's mother had dared to say to her so rudely, but she couldn't pretend she had not heard those words, which cut her to the very core. "What's that all about, Elliot?" had asked his mother, looking bemused. "What were you saying to Lily, Mum?" Mrs. Montgomery had chuckled. "Nothing that concerns you, Elliot. It's just a little girl's secret," she said, tapping her nose and casting Lily a pronounced glare. Of course, the guileful woman had turned on the charm in front of her son, asking Lily if she'd like more roast potatoes. "No, thanks," Lily had said politely. "Of course, do forgive me, Lily," said Mrs. Montgomery. "What was I thinking? The girl's watching her weight like a hawk. Well, you'll have to, dear, if you want to keep that son of mine interested in you. He likes a woman who takes care of herself, don't you, Elliot?" "Oh, Mum, you do talk such nonsense," Elliot had piped. "If you must know, I think Lily's a little on the thin side. She could do well with gaining a little bit more weight. And she dresses rather formal, a little like you're inclined to do, Mother. I'd like to see her let her hair down, get her hands dirty for a change, and you could do the same, Mother. I don't remember the last time you padded around the yard in your bare feet." "Nothing wrong with being thin, son," said Mrs. Montgomery. "And as for padding around in the yard in my bare feet, that's not going to happen." Whenever Mrs. Montgomery could put a spanner in the works by using her sharp, obnoxious tongue to deride Lily, she would. When Lily had been invited around to the farmhouse on numerous occasions, she had sat down for dinner with Elliot's family, and his mother always managed to weave her poisonous remarks into the conversation, which always seemed to succeed in putting Lily down. But Elliot never seemed to notice the insult that was being directed at her, like a missile. "What a lovely dress, dear! Don't you look lovely?" she said on one occasion. "It looks remarkably like the old housecoat I used for cleaning the house a while ago. Very practical for those filthy jobs. I would borrow it myself from you for cleaning the cobwebs, but let's just say I'm not very keen on bright pink. It's not my favourite colour." If Lily hadn't fallen for Elliot hard, she would have run away from her relationship with him faster than a March hare. But she had fallen so hopelessly in love with him. She knew that the artful Mrs. Montgomery would stop at nothing to break them apart limb from limb, but she was biding her time, waiting for the opportune moment to devastate their relationship with her jagged claws that, although were not physically discernible, were definitely there. Lily was certain that the slippery woman had succeeded in destroying all of Elliot's previous relationships. Mrs. Montgomery was cunning, like a black panther hiding in the shadows that would drag you down at the perfect time, as timing was everything when it came to unleashing her wrath on her unsuspecting victims. Lily was sure of that. The trouble with Elliot Montgomery was he was naively ignorant as far as his mother was concerned, and falsely believed the sun shone out of her backside, and try as she might, she could not persuade him differently. But in many ways Elliot was a bit of a mummy's boy, which was a big problem. "I don't like your mum," Lily had told him. "She's conniving, very manipulative. She doesn't like me at all, Elliot. I think she'll stop at nothing to break us apart."
"Funny you should say such a thing. That's what most of my girlfriends used to say over the years. Don't let her get you down, Lily. In her eyes, no one is good enough for me. But I'm sure with time you will grow on her." Chance would be a fine thing, Lily had thought to herself. It didn't look like anything grew on Alice Montgomery. She had noticed that even the family's 2 spaniels, who are naturally soppy by nature as a breed, gave that venomous woman a wide berth. And who could blame them? Dogs were discerning animals. Lily believed they could sense things. Had they picked up what a monster Elliot's mother really was? She suspected as much. Lily's attention was momentarily diverted to the wall clock, hanging in pride of place on the beige walls of the estate agent. It was noisily ticking away at every passing second, reminding Lily of the pressure she was now under. Elliot had already intruded on the silence by phoning her officers on the landline. "It would be great if you arrived early this evening. Mum is cooking us quite the spread for dinner tonight. She's going to be very put out if you arrive late, Lily. You know what she's like, so please get here on time."
"I'm on my way," Lily had said. The office was very quiet. Everyone had left. Once again she glanced at the clock. It was 6 o'clock. She was already cutting it way too fine. At least Lily had been invited to spend the weekend and stay over in the guest room at Mrs. Montgomery's farmhouse, as sharing a bedroom with her son would certainly be out of the question. As if Mrs. Montgomery could put the Atlantic Ocean between the 2 of them, she surely would do so, despite the fact that her son was 28 years old. Lily sighed as she tossed the piles of paperwork to one side. She had to leave the offices now. She didn't have time to change into something more casual for dinner. She was stuck wearing her business suit, and she could already hear Mrs. Montgomery's scathing, condescending comments about the way she was attired for dinner this evening. It was too bad. She couldn't do anything about her appearance. She had to get moving, or she'd be late for dinner, as it was an hour's drive to the Montgomery farmhouse. Lily reluctantly locked up the offices and moved towards the carport, where her maroon Ford Mustang had been parked during the day. The bonnet was surprisingly warm for early in the evening. She reluctantly climbed into the truck, hauling her overnight suitcase into the front seat, along with a bottle of high-quality wine she'd bought for Mrs. Montgomery. Not that the woman would appreciate any generous gestures on her part, or high-quality wine for that matter. Lily turned up the dial of the car radio as she drove through the bright lights of Portland until she got deeper into the heart of the countryside, where she found herself driving down quaint rural roads without a street light in sight. Elliot had shown her a shortcut to their property, but everything at night was so ambiguously obscure. It was hard to navigate her way down less than accommodating dirt roads that caused her rattling truck to judder and jolt precariously, and the bottle of red wine to roll around and shake in the front seat. The road she was travelling down was full of cracks and miniature potholes, and every now and then pebbles would ting against the lower grille. "I shouldn't have taken this shortcut," she chastised herself. "I'm making things twice as long for me. I don't know where the hell I am now, and I can't see a street sign anywhere. This is all I need." She had dreadful visions in her mind of Mrs. Montgomery's triumphant, self-satisfied, smug face as she arrived for dinner late. It would be another notch to her bedpost to prove to her son Elliot that Lily was an unreliable girlfriend who would always let him down. "Hello, dear," she would lightly say. "I see you couldn't make it in time for dinner. We can't accuse you of keeping us all waiting, can we?" She'd lightly smirk. "Now, thanks to you, dinner is stone cold, but don't mind us." She glanced at the clock on the dash. It was 7:15. She was expected for dinner at 7:30, and she knew she was lost. How would she get to the farmhouse on time, when all that she could see ahead of her was the road, washed under the bright scrutiny of her car lights? But on either side of the road she had passed rolling meadows and embankments clustered with large congregations of ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees. But she hadn't seen a single farmhouse for miles, and the moonlight tonight was scant, for it was hidden behind a thick, foggy cloud cover. There was no traffic on this quiet, super-skinny road, so Lily felt incredibly alone, very isolated. The road had become so narrow that you could barely swing a cat. In a trice she almost went thundering into the back wheel of a motorcyclist that she hadn't even seen. It seemed as if he had appeared from nowhere. Lily's car lights revealed his black leather biker's jacket and beaten-up helmet. She clenched her body tightly, in readiness for an impact she was expecting to happen. She couldn't slow down her car in time, nor could she swerve out of the way or skillfully overtake the motorbike when there was no space to manoeuvre her car. The motorcyclist was far too close for comfort. Why was he not accelerating down the road faster to get away from her car, she wondered. She was slamming down her brakes hard. Things steamrolled forward far too quickly for comfort, so Lily was bracing for this impact. She shut her eyes as she waited for the crunch of metal, but the motorbike sprang into action in the nick of time. Suddenly he put his foot down on the accelerator and whipped a hand in the air to make a fist at her. And then she watched the rear red light of his bike vanish into the darkness. The buzz of his motor could be heard a long way off after he'd left the scene. And there she was in the road, silent again. Lily's heart bounced around her chest like a tennis ball. Her fists held onto the steering wheel very tightly. Oh my God! That had been far too close, she thought, realizing that if the motorcyclist hadn't speeded away in time, she might well have run him right over. It was a sobering thought that she did not want to entertain. "I hate driving at night," she told herself. "I hate it. I absolutely hate it. What am I doing out here in the middle of a country road at night like this, trying to find my boyfriend's farmhouse in this dreadful maze?" Finally, the narrow road seemed to widen and straighten out. She accelerated a little, picking up speed. She was barely doing 40 at this stage, but there was no time to stop for the ambiguous shape that suddenly appeared before her like a ghostly shadow. Two silvery grey eyes glinted at her truck, and then she struck flesh and bone. She hit something hard, but the motion had swung her car out of control. For a moment the impact made her lose her grip on the steering wheel. The car spinned, and she could only see a darkness ahead of her. She jammed her foot onto the brake as hard as she could, but her truck continued to move with a mind of its own, paying little heed to her powerful braking. She found herself veering violently towards bushes and trees at a fearsome speed. The bottle of red wine on her front seat, meant for Mrs. Montgomery, was airborne. It crashed violently against the windscreen, shattering everywhere, and red wine like blood trickled down the opaque panes, looking like a scene of carnage had decimated the entire car. Her body jerked sideways and swung forward, hitting the edge of the embankment with a loud crashing sound, so the whole front of her car buckled inwards like a folding can of baked beans, bringing the car to a grinding stationary halt, which was just as well, as a little further forwards and she would have plundered straight ahead into a tall, very sturdy ponderosa pine tree. and that might well have killed her instantly. Lily gasped in astonishment. Her whole body began to shake involuntarily, like a leaf, and she could taste the bile rising up in the back of her throat. The front part of her Mustang was wrecked. Her truck was a complete write-off. This was all she needed, in the middle of the night like this, when she didn't know where the hell she actually was, and when she had no means of calling out for help, for there wasn't a human soul in sight for miles. And this was a time when cell phones were a dream in the future that had not been brought into fruition yet. "I'll never take a shortcut again," she told herself gingerly. "What was I thinking? Everything looks the same at night. One country road looks much the same as another, and the signposting around here is atrocious." She glanced over her shoulders to see the animal she had collided with on the right-hand side of the road. It was lying there, staring at her blankly through its silvery eyes, with one broken antler dangling ominously over its head like a trailing vine over a wall. She had seen it seconds before impact, those eyes along with the antlers cast in the beam of her headlights. She unclasped her safety belt, and as she did so a shooting pain ran down her abdomen. But after some slow breathing exercises, the pain thankfully seemed to subside. "I think I'm all right," she told herself, but a little shocked. She staggered awkwardly outside her car, like an inebriated, unsteady drunk. Her movements were a little ungainly. She carried her flashlight in her hands. Her flat shoes were beating awkwardly against the rocky piles of pebbles that fringed the undulating dip of the embankment. She moved towards the front of her truck to get a better view of the damage that had been done. It was so much worse than she imagined. The front part of the truck was not salvageable. The arches over the front wheels were crushed against the tyres. The battery of her truck was flat and completely dead, and the headlights had been cruelly shattered. So without her torch, she'd definitely be fumbling around in the pitch black. She ran her hands across the buckled exterior, her fingers covered with a liquid warmth, which under the light of her torch she realised was the deer's blood. She manoeuvred herself around the truck, holding on to its metallic surfaces for support to steady herself. She moved towards the prostrate shape of the deer, lying over 30 feet away from her, with a silver cloud-like vapour rising above it. The creature was breathing. It was still alive. She moved reluctantly towards it, with a vacillating hesitancy. She noticed the cloud-like vapour suddenly dissipated, and no more rose up from the deer. Did this mean it had suddenly died? She hoped so. She wasn't sure she had the ability to put it out of its misery, but she hated to see suffering of any kind. She squinted into the gloom, moving towards the deer, her torchlight checking for the rise and fall of any breathing, but none came. The deer's eyes appeared to be glazed over like a dead fish. His head was slanted at an unusual angle, its antlers dangling over the head. The antlers looked like gnarled, broken branches from a tree. She could smell the pungent, musty aroma from the deer, and the coppery smell of its blood, which pooled around its body unapologetically. "I need to move the deer out of the road," she told herself, "even if there are no drivers around. It could inadvertently cause an accident if anybody else was to drive down this road and failed to see it." She trotted over to the animal, grabbing it by its back legs that were still very warm. She dragged it to the opposite side of the road. She was surprised by its weight. The antler hanging over its head broke away. She picked it up loosely in her hand and placed it on the deer on the side of the road, and bending down on her hands and knees, she apologized to it. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you. I hope you weren't in too much pain." She felt so guilty for having ended this magnificent creature's life, but there was nothing she could do about it. Lily scrambled over to the trunk of her truck and pulled out her gym bag, relieved to find her sneakers buried at the bottom. With trembling hands still shaken from the desperate shock and covered in a plethora of the deer's blood, she bent down to put on her sneakers, removing her impractical pumps off her feet, which was a relief. She threw them in the back of the trunk. She pulled off her smart jacket she'd been wearing to work all day and stuffed it into her gym bag, and in her overnight bag in the front seat, under the mangled dashboard, she managed to retrieve a casual sweater and a windbreaker. Even though it was early summer, the temperature had dipped this evening, and there was a cool breeze blowing,
so the towering trees around her all rustled as their needled boughs bobbed up and down in the wind. The shock of the evening had made the cold significantly more conspicuous. I could stay in the truck till morning, she told herself, or I could walk down some of these country roads to find a farmhouse, to get help. The night was ominously dark, as the moonlight still remained shrouded in a tenebrous cloud cover. The stars were so dim they were barely visible. It was then that Lily decided the course of action she was surely to take. As put simply, the other uninspiring alternative of remaining in her beat-up Mustang until the morning left her feeling very unsettled, and supposing it began to drip petrol, it could potentially be a fire hazard. She'd walk down these country roads herself, hopefully finding a farmhouse along the way. There had to be a one around, surely. Then she could call Elliot and tell him exactly what had happened. She could only imagine the dreadful things Elliot's mother was saying about her right now, that she hadn't arrived for dinner. Typical! I knew that girl was trouble, Elliot, the moment I laid my eyes on her. She decided something else was far more important than joining us for dinner tonight. But did she even bother to cancel the dinner? Absolutely not. That young lady's got no manners. You're better off without her, Elliot. What would Elliot think, she wondered? Would he agree with his mother's rude appraisal of her lateness? Would he be influenced by his mother's cutting, cursory words? Very likely, she thought. Why couldn't Elliot see how much control and influence his mother had over his life? Lily shrugged her shoulders. There was nothing she could do now about not turning up for dinner. It was too late. She just needed to find a farmhouse. Organise someone to tow her away in the morning. The car would eventually end up as scrap metal. She'd have to find a telephone to make some phone calls. Maybe Elliot would come and collect her from a local farmhouse. As Lily continued to walk, she discerned the sounds of cracks and pops of branches that came from the opposite side of the road. Every time she walked, she could hear something else ambling opposite her, on the slightly raised embankment that was thick with lofty, towering trees that were veiled magnanimously in dusky showers of twilight. Was she being stalked, she wondered, and if so, by what? She was alone on this road, so the hairs on the back of her neck stood up on end, and her heart began to beat around in her chest, and a smattering of sweat bespeckled her forehead. She tried to wipe it away with the back of her hand. She picked up speed, but whatever was walking alongside her, masked by the trees, appeared to be walking in unison, copying her every move. When she stopped, so did it. She was certain she was being followed by some kind of predatory beast. Lily felt a fear gripping her heart. She regretted not staying with the truck out there on the road. She was vulnerable, as anything loitering in the dark shadows could pounce out on her and drag her away for a quick, easy meal. A mountain lion, perhaps, or a cunning pack of coyotes, as they could easily outsmart the likes of her. Lily picked up speed, as well as a long piece of timber she found lying on the side of the road that she could use as a weapon. In her haste, she ambled over some loose stones in the road with an increased speed that lay in wait for her like a guileful trap, so that her steady gait was removed in a trice, and she found herself ungainly, stumbling to the ground. She tripped and landed flat on her face with a mighty thud, badly grazing the back of her hands and the corner of her chin and lip. She could taste blood spurting in her mouth, while a shooting, insufferable pain seemed to spread up her ankle, and she realized she'd sprained it quite badly. This was all she needed. She hobbled awkwardly to her feet, groaning in agony, wincing in pain. All of a sudden she sensed something was looking directly at her. From the trees she could see a pair of eyes emitting a yellow eyeshine at about 8 feet off the ground, staring directly at her. It sent the fear of God shooting through her body like a firecracker. Was the owner of those ominous, terrifying yellow eyes the dreadfully scary thing that was stalking her? But what the hell was it? Oh my God, she thought, her heart beginning to race. She tried to hobble down the road as quickly as she could, but her movements were strained. The pain was excruciating. I've got to move faster, she told herself. Something is following me. You can do it. You can do it. Focus. Her father was right about one thing. Maybe one needed to call it quits on days that refused to smile down at you, days when things turned decidedly sour. If she'd gone to bed, cancelled dinner tonight, called it a day, she would by now be cosily tucked up in her bed at home, in her apartment, only to wake up the following morning to a brighter, much more agreeable day. Now she was aimlessly wandering down the long ribbon of dirt, left to the exploitative mercy of a deadly predator, who should chance upon her, like the ambiguous thing that was following her, the owner of those terrifying yellow eyes. She didn't want to think about the end of her story tonight, for she was certain, like the deer earlier on this evening, she would meet with a similar fate. Lily was unable to find her bearings. She knew without a shadow of a doubt she was hopelessly lost. It crossed her mind that she might be better off returning back to the car. But supposing there was a farmhouse around the very next turning? She'd been walking for long enough. She was exhausted. She felt as if she could just drop down from fatigue, and the pain in her ankles was hindering her performance. That was when the big thing with the bright yellow eyes that had been stalking her thundered through the trees, and in that moment Lily knew she was dead. Whatever came charging towards her moved as fast as a rhino thundering through the thicket, and there was no way with a sprained ankle that she could outrun a thing like this. Lily, seized with an awe-consuming terror, cried out and screamed, but words failed to come out of her mouth. The scream was all internal. Her heart banged violently against her chest wall, and her instinctive fear response, fired up by an adrenaline surge, was urging her to run. But the pain shot up her ankles, incapacitating her natural reflexes. No wonder injured animals in the wild were sitting ducks for predators. She was a sitting duck. Then she saw it. Lily let out a shrill scream. Whatever was standing within feet of her was a tall, lofty creature, towering at 10 feet, with ponderous shoulders 4 feet wide across, and a body max index that would easily break the charts in any doctor's office, for this idiosyncratic beast would likely need to be weighed on an industrial scale. This thing was gargantuan, hairy, burly, standing on 2 feet with the gait of a human. Lily shut her eyes tightly, bracing herself for the attack that she was expecting to come her way. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.